Well, buddy, good to see you. Everybody online, thanks for joining us as well. Great week, love it. Hey, you know what the highlight of my week was? My weeks are pretty predictable, right? So up at summer camp, we had a collapsed septic system in drain field. Guess who's the most unskilled laborer in the church? So this, it was so much fun. On Friday, we just dug massive holes all over camp and covered them back up. And now I'm looking forward to many of you using and testing out this new septic system. It's fantastic. Drain lines like you wouldn't believe. 14 hours of manual labor, though, made me feel like my age a little bit. I was like, oh, woke up the next morning. So we're in this series in 1 Corinthians. This was going to be the last week, but I started reading chapter 16 and realized it's 2 weeks, sorry. So this week, next week we'll wrap it up. But this week, I'm really thrilled that Paul includes us into his book. He's writing about mid-50s AD, probably the first book in the New Testament that's actually written. And Paul, think of all the things he's been covering. If you were here regularly or sporadically, he's talked about everything from the power of the cross in our lives to surrender and how do you get along with people and making sure that we aren't divisive and our allegiance isn't to other human leaders, but it's to Jesus. He's talked a lot about human sexuality. He's talked about the problems. He's addressed multiple problems in this dysfunctional church. Yet he sees the beauty in the church, even though it is dysfunctional. And then as he's wrapping up his book in chapter 16, we're just going to look at the first 4 or 5 verses where Paul talks about something that I think it's just essential for us today. He's going to talk about generosity. He's going to address, in the whole book, he hasn't talked at all about people's financial lives. He hasn't talked about that, but he talks about it here. And it'd be interesting to note, I'd love for you to read this on your own. In his second book to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, chapter 8 and 9 is given over to this. He talks about it significantly. Now, whenever we talk about finances or generosity, I know some people, especially if you're spiritually unresolved or you had a bad experience, you're getting nervous right now, you're looking for your purse, you're looking for your wallet, I want to keep this with me. We have a phrase that we use around here a lot, and I reiterate it time after time with all of our team and leaders. We say this: we want something for people, not from people. Okay? We want something for you, not from you. And too often when we talk about generosity, it's because the church is in need. It's a good time to talk about giving, right? And we don't want anything from you. We don't. We want something for you. And Paul wanted something for the people in Corinth because he knew that their financial lives and the power of greed were incredibly significant 2,000 years ago and are just as significant, if not more so, in our unbelievably prosperous society. It's just as significant today. And so Paul's going to lay out, this is what we're going to do. There's 5 steps to move towards generosity. And even if you aren't sure what you believe, I think that these steps could really, really be helpful for you, okay? So it's just gonna be general principles. And then for those of us who have been following the Lord, and maybe some of us have already stepped into this, Paul's got some challenges for us as well, all right? Let's read together 1 Corinthians chapter 16, the first several verses. Now about the collection for the Lord's people. Notice this, Paul is directing this towards people in need. We'll talk more about that. Do what I told the Galatian churches to do. That's a neighboring region of the Roman Empire. On the first day of every week, step number 1, each one of you should, step number 2, set aside a sum of money, step number 3, in keeping with your income, number 4. Saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable for me to go also, they will accompany me. All right, just those verses. Let's talk a little bit about this. Number 1, let's ask this question: what is this collection for? Why is Paul fundraising? What's the purpose? Well, here's what's happening. From 46, 47 AD until about 59 AD, there was a significant drought and famine in Jerusalem. Okay, so the Romans called it Palestine. That was the name they gave it eventually. But it was like year after year of drought, shortage, and it led to a significant food crisis. So Paul's Jewish, although he spent most of his life traveling throughout the Roman Empire, but he still has contacts back in Jerusalem. He probably has family that lives there, friends, and he hears that this place where Jesus lived his life, where the church began, is now facing significant trouble. It's like year after year. So for those of us who are in Montana, like we're getting a little bit of a glimpse of drought this year. You noticed it? Like you drive by and the wheat's about this tall, right? I don't know about you, but I just got my water bill from my lawn. I was like, oh, Nelly, right? It's a dry year. We're starting to think about it. Well, this happened year after year after year. In an agrarian society like this, they got to the point where like, we just don't have enough food. So Paul hears and he says, you know what? I'm gonna ask other followers of Jesus to begin to exhibit generosity to actually address the physical needs of other people. Okay, so that's why he's taking this collection. Even though he gives them this instruction, a year later, he writes 2 Corinthians and they still haven't done anything about it. We'll talk about that in a moment. All right, so now Paul lays out these 5 really simple, but I think if you could apply these to your life wherever you're at, these are gonna be so helpful. There's so much confusion in our world regarding money and what it does. And is it a tool? Is it a trophy? Is it something you hold on to and display? Or is it something that you use? Here's what Paul says. Here's 5 steps, 5 practical ways to exhibit, to begin generosity in your life. Number 1, on the first day of every week, discipline and consistency. Now, what was significant about the first day of the week? Yeah, it was the Lord's Day, right? This is typically when they went to church. But Paul just says this, I want you to pick a day. And what if it was the day where you actually gathered together as a community and worship, and part of your actual thinking as you projected forward and thought about the work week coming, what if you said, I'm gonna make some decisions today about how I will be living my life financially the rest of the week. And so what he's inviting them into is discipline and consistency. Because I think so often we think, well, I'll get to that, right? I'll get to that eventually. First I gotta address this problem and that crisis and this issue. Well, Paul just says this, if you wanna learn how to be a generous person, and you wanna begin to tear the power of money apart in your life, just make a decision. Now, what would that be for you? I don't know. You know what it is for me? It's you guys pay me every 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks, boom, here it is. I'm going to give. This is a habit that we've had established. Why? Because I can easily just kind of let it go. Like it's good intentions, but it's just a discipline. So Paul invites discipline, pick a day, pick a time. This is what we do together. Here's the second step. Each one of you. So Paul is going to invite all the followers of Jesus to get involved in this. Now, here's the reality. In the United States of America, I don't have statistics for the rest of the world. In the United States of America, there's actually a very small minority of people who regularly give any significant portion of their money at all. I think what we tend to do is we've had all these amazing benefactors in American society, like, you know, who leave behind museums and leave behind like money for colleges, and we'll think, well, they've got so much. Like that responsibility is theirs, right? But Paul is writing to a church. We know, because we've been reading this book, there are slaves and there are free people. There are poor and there are wealthy people. In fact, one of his biggest points of angst is that wealthy people have been unjust towards the poor. And Paul says this, it's not like if you don't have any money, Paul says, but you're fine, you don't have enough, don't worry about it. Everybody who meets this median threshold, they need to be generous. Paul knows that the power for money to grab our heart is very real, whether you make $15,000 a year or $150,000 a year. He says, this is just part of following Jesus. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, like you're free on this one. But when you are a follower of Jesus, Paul says, I don't want some of us to go like, well, it's not on me. Like that's for those guys over there. He says, I want everybody involved in this. Here's his third step. Set aside a sum of money. meaning you designate it. So he says the first day of the week, I want all of you to set aside a sum of money. So the Bible has this word that's used throughout the Old Testament, and it's one of those words we read it and we're like, what does that mean? The word is consecrate, okay? Consecrate, which means to set it aside for God. So Paul says this, when you take that, I want you to set it aside. Like, this is not for me. This is not for my family or the needs or whatever. This is now God's. It is designated for him, because here's what happens in our lives. Has anybody experienced unexpected financial crisis in their life? The transmission went out, right? The roof needs to be replaced. And what so often happens is we're like, well, I'm gonna need this. And Paul just says this, make a decision that that is no longer a part of your life, of your budget. You just designate it, you set it aside, and you say, I'm gonna operate with this percentage. That percentage, it doesn't have my name on it anymore. It is gone. So designate it. His next step is this, in keeping with your income. Fascinating. So if you have a membership to Costco, everybody pays the same price for your membership, right? Wouldn't it be weird if they checked your income and oh, you're low income, your fee for the year is $35. Oh, you're high income, your fee for the year is $3,500. Paul says this should be proportionate. So in the ancient Hebrew scriptures, everything that was written before Jesus, there was this thing called a tithe, okay? That was at the bedrock of their society. This is how their whole worship life operated. This is how all social welfare happened, is that everybody who was a part of Israel just gave automatically 1/10 tithe of their income. If you were a rancher and you had 100 lambs born to you that spring, it's actually written in the law that you took not your 10 worst lambs, but you took the best 10, the ones that you wanted to keep. You want to keep their genes within your herd. You take those 10 and you go, God, I trust you, and these 10 are surrendered. If you're a farmer, you had a harvest. You took the 10% of the harvest that was the best, and you said, this is yours. So here's what this proportionate means. It means it's equally painful for everybody, right? If you make $1,000 a month and you decided to say, hey, I'm gonna give away 10%. When you make $1,000 a month, giving away 10%, $100, is painful, isn't it? You're nodding your head aggressively. You're dealing with this right now. If you make $10,000 a month, giving away $1,000 is equally painful. In fact, sometimes when you add zeros, it hurts even more. Whoa, that's a lot of money, right? So here's what Paul says. He goes, I'm not looking for everybody has to give the same. We're looking for equal sacrifice. In keeping with your income, there's a beautiful story where Jesus is with his disciples and they're at the temple and they're watching people give. Okay, it's just part of it. And there's several wealthy people that come through and they give a lot because they have a lot. And then this widow comes through and she barely has anything, but she gives her 2 simple coins. And here's what Jesus does. He looks at his disciples and he says, hey, I want you to pay attention to this. Everybody else gave out of their excess because they had plenty. This lady, she gave out of her need. So what Jesus celebrated was not the amount given, right? It was the sacrifice involved. So he says, in keeping with your income. Next, he says, to the men you approve. And then he says, and actually, if you want me to be there, I'll go with them. So what Paul is saying is, I want you to give responsibly. Okay? I want you to think through, where are you gonna give? What are you gonna give to? Did you know that money doesn't solve poverty? Man, we found that all over the world in our mission work. You can't throw money at poverty and fix it. It has to be more thorough and more holistic than that. And so Paul says, I want you to pick people that you can trust, and I want you to take this money and I'll go with them if you need me to. And we'll write a letter. And this letter says, here's from your friends up in Corinth, X amount of dollars involved. And then they take it, these trustworthy people take it, and there's a receipt so you can tell how much money started in Corinth and how much money ended up in Jerusalem. And so we want to be wise. Sadly, there are lots of nonprofit organizations out there where 80% of what's given goes to administrative expenses, and 20% actually goes to the thing that you wanted to support originally. And so you want to be thoughtful about this. You want to target it. One of the goals that we have around here is so once a month I have a church council meeting with a group of people who run the finances of the church, and we always say this: we want to be the best place to give to and through, the most responsible place imaginable. So wherever you give, whatever you give, make sure that you're giving in a thoughtful, careful way. Your money should not go to buying a pastor a new airplane, all right? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so there's these 5 steps. I think if you could think through those, maybe apply them to your life. Now, I want to address a couple of questions. Now, as a pastor, okay, here's the first question you ask when you read this text. Why doesn't Paul mention the ancient concept of the tithe? Because that would be so much easier for me. In fact, you have to ask even a broader question. You know, in all the churches that Paul starts and all the letters he writes, he never teaches them the ancient Hebrew practice of giving away 10% of your income. Jesus only mentions tithing once. Now, in Jewish society, it was just a given. Like everybody gave, right? It was part of how you grew up. It was part of how their whole society worked. But Jesus only mentions it once, and he mentions it in this context. The Pharisees, who were like the professional Bible teachers of the day, they are so diligent when they give that when you went to the market and you bought spices, you'd measure out 1/10 of the spices and give that to God, and then the rest you'd package up and keep for yourself. So Jesus says, you Pharisees, you are so diligent, you tithe off your spices, but here's the problem. You forget the greater issues of mercy and justice. You do what you expect God needs of you. But you forget about being merciful. You forget about justice. This is just a system to you. So why is the tithe not mentioned? Here's why. Jesus brings a different ethic when it comes to finances. And here's his ethic. It's surrender and stewardship. Surrender and stewardship. This is similar to when Jesus is going through the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments. And he says things like this. He said, you've heard it say, thou shalt not murder. But I tell you, if you even looked at someone and thought, I wish they would die, you've committed murder in your mind. Jesus actually elevates the moral expectations for human beings. Why? Because he's like, now you can actually do this. And when it comes to giving, this 10% thing is beautiful. It's how that society functioned. It's how social welfare happened. But Jesus seems to say, actually, my expectation from my followers is stewardship. Here's my best illustration of stewardship. Typically, we live our hands like this. I live our life with our hands clenched, right? This is mine. I need to hold on to it. I was so profoundly disappointed at my daughter's first word. She's 25 years old. She's a phenomenal young woman. I worked so hard to teach her to say daddy. We practiced every day because I just thought that would be awesome if one of her first words was daddy. You know the first word I ever heard her say? Mine. We never practiced it. I never sat there and said, mine. It just came somewhere deep within her soul. It came bursting forward. That's mine. And here's the problem with humanity, is deep within us. At the core of who we are afraid. We're afraid that we won't have enough. We're afraid that God doesn't actually care about us. And the power of greed seeps into our life. And we're saying, mine. So this is stewardship. It's when you open up your life, your heart, and you say, it's yours. I don't own it. I don't own it. I am here just to manage this for you. That's what Jesus is asking you. He doesn't say, give me your 10%. He says, what if you gave me everything and you trusted me? Years ago, this was illustrated to me by this fantastic lady. We talked about something like this. This is probably 18 years ago. And I remember she walked down, I just finished talking, and she was walking down the aisle, and she had this huge, like, beaming look on her face. And I was like, boy, something good happened with her. So I came off and I met her down here, and I said, hey, what's going on? You look so happy. She looked at me and she said, you remember what we talked about last week in church? I said, yeah, we talked about stewardship and like New Testament followers of Jesus, we don't own anything, we're just stewards. She looks at me and smiles and goes, well, guess what happened this week? I'm like, I don't know what happened. She goes, somebody stole God's car right in front of my house. I was like, God's car? Yeah, you told me it wasn't mine. So all week I haven't been worried about it. Somebody's driving around in God's car and he knows where they are. He's better than LoJack, right? You're like, there's my car. And I just looked at her face and I realized this is what Jesus was talking about. Because if it's mine and it's taken, oh, my car, now what am I gonna do? She just had this beautiful sense of, I'm surrendered to him. It wasn't my car, so God's gotta figure this out. He's gotta take care of it. He's gotta give me a new car. He's gotta find that one, I don't know. But that's stewardship, is where it's just like, hey, it's not mine, it is yours. Now, when it comes to stewardship, here's why this is so important. Jesus makes what for me has been the most penetrating, most revealing statement possible in the book of Matthew. Okay, we gotta walk through this. By the way, Jesus talked more about money and finances than all the other New Testament writers combined. This is a big deal to him, and here's why it's a big deal. Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Right? You can't have two. You can only serve one. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. So he's saying there is going to be a constant tension within the life of my followers. Like this will be master or that will be master. And this is what he says. You cannot serve both God and money. He says the human condition means this, that you will have one of two gods. It'll either be Jesus or it will be money. And here's what happens. In my life and in your life, there is a constant tension. Now, you might say, well, who worships money? I'd say this. I think most of us are drawn into that. I think being a part of the capitalistic, really successful empire that we're a part of, we are so blessed, the most wealthy group of people the world has ever seen here in the United States of America. Is there is a constant tension in our lives. If we put our faith and our trust and our contentment and our peace in money, that means that money is our God. Right? So if I think, boy, I don't have any peace in my life, but if I could just have this type of nest egg, then I'd be content, then I'd be at peace. If I could just have this thing, then I'd no longer be worried about the future. If I could just have something that's shiny, the new house, the new this, the new that, then I'd finally be contentment. And when I project those things upon money, I am trusting money to be my God. And Jesus says, this is always happening in your life. And so what I wanna do instead, if you're a follower of Jesus, is you say, you know what? I know that money cannot bring me peace. The only thing that can bring me peace is God. I know that no matter how much money I have, I will never be content. Contentment comes from God, from me saying, I'm grateful for everything I have, rather than saying, if I just had more, then I'd be happy. There is a war that is happening in every human being's life. Who do I trust? Do I trust God or do I trust money? I was rummaging through my wallet. I think this is fascinating. I think it's a beautiful statement, maybe a little bit of irony involved too. $1 bill on the back. In God we trust. $5 bill. in God we trust. 20, in God we trust. Somehow, a long time ago, some wise but imperfect people who decided what U.S. currency would look like said this: what if we put a statement on the back of our currency that said we don't trust in this. This is not our God. In God we trust. Now the irony is what? We put a lot of trust in this stuff, right? I'm gonna try an exercise this week. Never done it before, just because I want to put this into practice. Every time I spend some cash, I'm gonna turn it to the back side, and I'm gonna hand it over, and I'm gonna make a statement. I don't trust in this. I trust in God. Trust in God. Because it's an ongoing discipline that will need to be a part of our lives. So here's why generosity is important. Because of this tension in your life and in my life. Because money is always calling to me. Because every advertisement you will ever see tells you that money makes you happy. The way that you combat the power of greed and trust in money as your God is through generosity. It just gives it a black eye. That's why Paul tells him, you begin to establish this in your life. These are brand new followers of Jesus. They've lived a completely different ethic when it comes to finances. And he says this: what if at the first day of the week, you knew that greed, you knew that there's a tendency in your life to begin to trust in finances. And what if you just punched it in the face every single week by saying, no, I choose first and foremost to be generous. I choose to be free from the love of money. It will not be my God. I serve him, and this is simply a tool, and I am a steward of it, not an owner, not an owner. This isn't easy. A year later, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9. Read that yourself if you get a chance. A year later, Paul writes to them, and he says, hey, remember we talked about in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, the people in need, and you said that you wanted to respond and you wanted to help, and they hadn't done anything? So Paul spends 2 chapters talking about biblical stewardship and talking about being generous. Why? Because it's tough. It's just not easy. The power of me trusting in money is profound in my life. Now, I want to close with just 5 principles. Some of them I'm going to reiterate what we already said, but I think these can really change how we live and our perspective. Number 1, and our conclusion is this: just remember that I am a steward, I am not an owner. I am a steward and not an owner. This changes everything, okay? It's not mine. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with the guy that works on my truck, and it's never good when your mechanic uses the term catastrophic failure. I was like, no, not catastrophic. That sounds very expensive. And he goes, it is. It is, right? So it started on me like, okay, what am I gonna do? Am I putting like $8,000 in this truck, or am I gonna find something different? You know what? I found a different truck. The title has my name on it, but it's not mine. It's not mine. I mean, it's really nice. When I sit in it, I'm like, I'm so happy. But it's yours, God. You want to take it away tomorrow? I'm okay, I got a bike. But I really like this, right? As long as you're gonna let me use this, I'm all for it, God, right? It just changes things. It can't be a trophy. It's just a tool for me to steward. Second principle would be this: make decisions about your finances. If not, there will always be a crisis. Here's how we just end up living when money has power in our lives. You're like, oh, I want to do that. I'm going to do that. And there's always some sort of crisis, isn't there? There's always the breakdown. There's always the need for tires. There's always like, we weren't anticipating that. And if you don't make decisions, that's what Paul invites them into. Make a decision the first day of the week. This is what I do with my finances. Otherwise, your finances will dictate who you are. You will begin to, when you see the pile of bills, you're just depressed, right? Like, how did this happen? I'll never get out of debt. The only way you stay out of debt or you climb out of debt is you just make decisions about what your finances are gonna do. You don't like shiny things beckon for you, don't they? I need that. You're like, no, I made decisions. I had a great conversation 2 weeks ago. My oldest son, he's in the military, he had a 5-day leave and he's 23 now and like just growing up and we were driving down the road, just the two of us, and he goes, hey, Dad, what's your financial philosophy? And he's been talking to, like, the Navy has financial planners for them and everything. And I'm like, yes, he's finally asking this question. And I said, well, Luke, it's pretty simple. I started teaching it to you when you were 2 years old. You remember? He said, you mean the 3 words? I go, yep. That's my financial philosophy. It's everything I know the Bible teaches on finances boiled down into 3 words. I go, you remember them? And he's like, yeah. Give, save, spend. Give, save, spend. I said, so son, you got to figure this out yourself. But for us, first thing we do is we decide what we're going to give, and nothing shakes that. And then we save, right? We make these decisions, and then we can spend out of what's left. Because what happens? Most of us do. Spend. Oh, I hope there's a little bit left. I'll save it. And if there's anything left after that, I'll give it. But it doesn't happen, does it? Right? You make decisions. Next, move beyond good intentions. Right? So this is where, just because I know the power of money and how real it is in our society, I think there are so many of us who are like, I want to do this. I've never met anybody in the world who said, you know what? I want to be greedy. Right? You know, I never want to help anybody. I want it for me. Nobody actually says that. Everybody was like, I would love to be more generous. I just can't afford to do it. Move beyond good intentions. Just figure this out. Paul says the first day of the week. That's today. Like figure out, you have my permission to get out your phone right now and figure out, how am I going to do this? If start small, start little, whatever it is, just start punching greed in the face. Start saying, it is not my master. I will not serve finances. I serve God. Be righteous, whether you are poor or wealthy. Okay, be righteous. I want to be careful what I say here, but I am very, very bothered by much of the teaching in the American church that has to do with money, because it focuses on this: wealth, wealth, wealth. God wants you to be wealthy. God wants you to have more. And you know, I believe that God is a God who blesses, but I think this is the real focus. Be righteous, meaning upstanding. You operate in God's economy. And please hear this. You can be poor and you can be unrighteous. You can be poor and you can trust in money, and you can be discontent, and you can be greedy and stingy. Being poor in and of itself is not a noble thing. But you can be poor and you can be righteous. You can be poor and you can trust in God. You can be poor and you can be generous. You can be poor and you can be content. And that is a beautiful thing. The goal is not to become wealthy. The goal is to be righteous, to reflect God, to not allow money to be something you worship. Be poor and be righteous. You can be wealthy. You can be wealthy and you can be completely unrighteous. You can be selfish. You can worship money. You can be stingy. You can still lack contentment. Or you can be wealthy, and if you are wealthy, we're also happy for you. Be righteous. Be generous, be content, be surrendered to Him. The goal is not to be wealthy. The goal is wherever you're at, God is yours. And I'm gonna be content and I'm gonna be generous. And then lastly is this: grow in the grace of giving. Okay, this is mainly, I'm gonna talk to the veterans. Okay, those of you who have been around for a while. I grew up, my parents taught me so many valuable lessons in this. I just don't wanna be like the Pharisees, who gave They gave 10% of their money, and Jesus was not impressed. He just was not impressed. Because to them, it was just like paying taxes. Anybody love paying taxes? Like one of your favorite things? No, but you just have to do it, right? And you're like, ugh, tax time, right? Giving should never be like, okay, here you go, God, this is your part. Now I get to live my life. This is something I need to be growing in constantly. So, Jane, I'll tell you a little something. Years ago, Jane and I, we were giving, I think 10%, by the way, is, please, ready? 10% is a great place to start, okay? Because stewardship means it's all his. So Jen and I were like, hey, let's up our giving 0.5% every year. Now, I should have thought about 0.5% a year. We've been married for 30 years. Ooh, it's getting bigger and bigger every year, right? But that's just the thing. Some years we can, some years we can't, but we want to continue to stretch. One of my favorite stories is, anybody read Purpose Driven Life by Rick Warren? It's a great book, right? Sold hundreds of millions of copies. So Rick Warren, he pastors Saddleback. He's actually in the process of retiring right now. Rick Warren had planted this church in Southern California that worked really hard, and he wrote this book. All of a sudden, he became a multimillionaire. What's he gonna do with it? So he and his wife sat down, and the first thing they did is they figured out how much the church had paid them over the last 35 years and paid it all back. And then, get this, he does what he calls reverse tithing. He lives on 10% and gives away 90%. What in the world? Now, you're saying, well, I'm gonna write a book too, and if God blesses me, I'll do that. Yeah. But the point is this, like he could have just done what he'd always been doing and it'd be fine. That is radical. When you write a book and hundreds of millions of copies get sold, here's what he's doing. I'm punching the power of money right in the face. I'm gonna live off of 10% and give 90%. The point is this, man, just keep growing in generosity. And if you're starting here, grow here. If you're starting here, make it bigger.